Welcome to the Selling Dreams podcast. Disclaimer: the Selling Dreams podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only. The views and opinions expressed by the hosts are his own and do not necessarily reflect those of the podcast creators or affiliates. Content may include discussions on sensitive topics that are intended to provide insights, not professional advice. We encourage listeners to seek professional guidance for any personal issues or concerns. Listener discretion is advised.
This episode discusses mature topics. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to episode 6. I'm your host, Freddie. Tonight we're looking at respect, rights, and relationships. Sexuality in the lives of persons living with disabilities, whether it be teens or adults. So let's get into it.
Myth: people with disabilities are asexual or incapable of relationships. Truth: sexuality is a natural part of life for everyone.
One of the most harmful myths that individuals with disabilities are asexual or incapable of forming relationships. Let's start by dismantling this false narrative. According to some of the advocacy groups out here, sexuality is a universal human experience. Both education and inclusion plays a key and pivotal role in this process. Listen to this key statistic. 70% of people with intellectual disabilities are never taught about relationships or consent. Now, I don't think in my personal life we got to the issue of consent until after Mike Tyson went to jail for rape. That is when the people around me, friends and family, really did have that discussion on consent. But essentially, I learned about consent through media. Basically watching what was happening in news at the time, watch the commentary that followed music videos, because 80s into 90s music videos were very, very suggestive of what relationships should be like. So consent, I by the time they got around to, hey, yeah, you need consent, I had a little gist of why you need consent versus what happens when you don't have consent. Cautionary tale. A lot of football players, black football players, black basketball players in college level athletics, and of course, Mike Tyson. So there's an advocacy group out there called The Arc. They tell a different story. They say that every person has the inherent sexual rights, including the right to intimacy, privacy, and sex education. So I know some of the religious people out there are going to have issues with that statement. Some intellectuals, in fact, I tried to poll some of my colleagues as some of you know, that I work at a special school. At the filming of this episode, I still work at a special school. So we have intellectual, physical, and slow learners at our unit. And sexuality is a big component of dealing with these kids. While ignoring a person's needs isn't just unfair, it can also leave individuals more vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. So it's not just you're ignoring their rights. You are exposing by not educating them properly about consent, about reproductive rights, about the protections under the law. You are allowing room for exploitation and abuse. 68% of women with developmental disabilities experience sexual violence in their lifetime. That is way too high. I understand we would love to preach abstinence, but a person with an intellectual disability or developmental disability, this prefrontal cortex, that front brain which is the last one to develop. That's why we urge in the US no consumption of alcohol until you're 21, because that part of the brain controls inhibitions. Now, in a person with intellectual or developmental disabilities, where that area, it can be either underdeveloped or not mature enough at time of sexual exploration. I think it's very, very important where the person needs to be educated, not just on consent, on good touch, bad touch, but they need to understand that it's not bad to have these urges. It is not something that you're going to be punished for because you have these urges. These urges are chemical urges and hormonal urges that are part of the natural development of every human being. We must remember that education and empowerment aren't optional. They are necessary. So how do we approach sexuality education for individuals with intellectual disabilities? Where the key is tailoring a message to their cognitive and developmental levels. So how do we approach sexuality education for individuals with intellectual disabilities? The key is tailoring the message to cognitive and developmental levels. Let's look at the ABCs of delivering quality at level sexual education. A. Use clear visual aids to teach concepts like consent, boundaries, and safe practices. B. Creating role-playing scenarios to build relational skills. You want to role-play. One of the best ways humans have been learning since time has started. Hunter-gatherers, you saw your elders demonstrate, and then you practice in the safety of a sterile environment, so that when it was your time, you knew what to do. It's the same thing with sexual education. C. Reinforcing lessons over time, since repetition can be critical for retention. We do this in a regular classroom. We do this with our own kids. Are we going to show a child to tie their lessons once? Or do we keep doing it over and over until they get it? Same thing with developmental delays and intellectual development issues. Repetition. So let's go it over again. Clear visual aids for teaching the concepts of consent, boundaries, and safe practices. We are looking at using role-play scenarios to build relational skills. And we're going to reinforce our lessons with repetition. A, B, C. Inclusive sexuality education is vital. Families and schools are obligated to teach those in our care who are fully functional sexual adults, teenagers and adults, the right way and the right concepts. Start early. Use clear language and repeat concepts often to reinforce understanding. As we said before, use visual aids, teach consent explicitly, and reinforce boundaries. So, let's look at the laws. Why are we going to the laws? At the filming of this episode, there is a person, a female person, who has Down syndrome. She has all the markers of Down syndrome. I'm not too sure which one of the Down syndrome visions she has, but she is mostly accompanied by two elderly persons who I believe are her parents. The lady appears to be in her late 40s, however is dressed as a 12-year-old. And her interactions that I have seen in the mall, in the grocery and stuff, is one of make pretend. So what she does, she's walking alongside or just behind her caregivers, and she makes eye contact and flirts with men in the aisles. Now she's dressed as a 12-year-old, so she's literally nice, simple, girlish dress, bows and all. Her hair is plaited too. I believe she's mixed between East Indian and another race. So she has nice, long, dark hair. And, there's these two ponytails. And she has ribbons. I'm talking about this lady in her late 40s. The caregivers seem to be like 70s, 60s, somewhere in that group. And they're aged. And sometimes they lose track of her. I've heard rumors that when they lose track of her, she has been found in strange parts of the grocery or isolated parts of the grocery, performing lewd acts with men. There's no excuse for that type of behavior, especially if a normal man of average intellect and average status. Come on, man. Yes, you may not have realized that because according to how they come here, her her bangs come forward a bit, and you don't see all the features, Down syndrome features all the time. But the fact that you're not cognizant enough to know, hey, something might be a little off because you're doing this in the bathroom of the grocery or in the car park behind the dumpster. The minute time you reach that level as a mature person, you need to check yourself. That is a nudity. All right, you're really stepping into it, almost criminal. So I bring this across to say that as an adult female, she has urges. But was she taught consent, boundaries, and appropriate place for this behavior? It's not my issue, it's not so much that she's doing it. I prefer anybody engaging in healthy sexual behavior. My issue is behind the dumpster. You could catch some diseases there other than the sexually transmitted diseases. You kind of, and then let's say some sicko sees her coming in from back there from a consensual encounter, and then decides that he wants her encounter, and by that time she's already satisfied. So you run into that abuse, criminal sexual abuse. Human reproductive rights. For those of you who may not know, there is a UN charter on the rights of disabled persons. It is a cornerstone of modern human understanding, where the UN got together all the nations on the planet and signed this document. It's called the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And this explicitly states that individuals with disabilities have the right to make decisions about their bodies, relationships, and reproduction. This includes the right to marry, have children, and access reproductive health care. So, where am I going with this? I've had first-hand knowledge of what I believe to be criminal behavior, where in order to prevent shame on the family, young women were mutilated, against their will, to prevent them getting pregnant. I remember the horror stories, hearing the horror stories coming out of Africa of female castration. Not just Africa, certain cultures believe that female castration would have made women more faithful. You should never have to mutilate another person's body in the name of chastity and purity. That archaic behavior is not acceptable. When I brought up not only my suspicions, but I had discussions with senior friends in law enforcement. How do you gather that evidence? That was the question that I was supposed to be. How do you gather that evidence? And you cross into a sector of law that should be clearly defined but is not. Parents have a right to govern medical procedures for their children. But do we make a law stating that what is mutilation? First, we have to define what is mutilation. What is genitalia mutilation or sexual mutilation? And then after you define that, then you outlaw it. This is way beyond my comprehension. I'm just, we're just having that conversation because I don't know how you feel about it. For me, I was one of the daughters. I have a beautiful stepdaughter who I see her so often from my first marriage. And the thing that somebody would have done her that would never, I would never agree to something like that or condone somebody doing that to a child. It's inhumane. We have to understand that people have freedom to choose and also have the right to equality and dignity. Again, the advocates keep saying over and over again, persons with disabilities have the right to marry, start families, and access reproductive health care without discrimination. Each country is different. Each country has their own set of laws governing access to reproductive health care. I'm not going to step on anybody's toes. That's not me. That's not my thing. That is something that you and your country needs to work out. I'm just saying, when it comes to disabled persons or persons living with disabilities, they have rights. They have the same human rights. Think about it this way. You got a born morning and you had a stroke. And that stroke left you with 85% cognitive function. How would you feel if the doctor, the government, and everybody else looks at you and says, because of your 85% cognitive deficit, 85% cognitive after this traumatic brain injury, you can't have sex anymore. You cannot enjoy sex anymore because you're only 85% intellectually cognitive. I have cognitive ability. You only have 85 cognitive ability compared to regular people who have 100. You can't have sex anymore. Let's say you were a serious catch before that stroke. You were a man of prominence. Ladies fell at your feet every time you stepped out the door. And now, because of a stroke, you tell me I can't have sex? No guy is gonna, nah. But then, child born with CP, damage to the motor cortex, so they have to walk with walking aid, whether it's a walker or some crutches or even wheelchair bound. And also damage to language center. So their language isn't smooth. It's not all there. Their language is a bit rough. They take a while to formulate their words and and to get the point across. And they probably have a developmental delay, a cognitive development delay about, let me say, 5 years. That's in there 5 years, but instead of acting 21, 20, they're acting 15, 14, 15. They're not understanding certain concepts. Are you going to tell this person you cannot have sex because you're in a wheelchair, and or you can't really explain yourself too much, and it takes you a little longer to get your thoughts out there? You're going to tell this person, nah, you can't get in a relationship, you can't have a boyfriend or girlfriend or get married or have sex or have children? For who to mind? Who will raise them children? The state? This is how a lot of people see persons with disabilities. Let's change it up a bit. You are a high functioning autistic person. You join the military. The military loves, US military, they love autistic, high functioning autistics. They have, as an NCO, man, you wish you had 100 of these guys. They follow orders. They're always on time. They don't question. They believe in authority. They believe they are on that propaganda bandwagon. But then they come back from deployment and he's hanging out with his buddies, and some of his members of his platoon were females. And they come to check him home, and his mother's like, oh no, he can't go drinking with you guys. He'll get in trouble if he goes drinking. Because you're afraid he's gonna have sex. He's gonna get drink, get a little while, and do what all Army and Marines do, have sex. You could die for the country, but you can't have sex. You can work at 9 to 5, pay your own bills, but you cannot get married. You cannot have sex and get married. Think about it. Think about how it looks. Let's stop it again. You are developmental delay 30-year-old. But functionally, you're probably about 9 mentally. Could we use that as an excuse not to allow you to have sex, not allow you to have a family of your own, because you're intellectually 9? You're physically 30. But you could live on your own, you could go to work, you could pay your bills, but we're not going to allow you to have a girlfriend or to have a child. Or you're a woman with cognitive delay, and because a man slept with you, he should be jailed because you could not give consent, because you lack the mental capacity to give consent. No, from a legal standpoint, yeah, he's going to go to jail. Once they cannot give consent, and that consent, y'all don't understand how hard consent is. Consent is one of those things that can be withdrawn at any time. Hot and heavy. You're doing it. Neck, hickeys. You are inside, hot and sweaty. We've been going at this for 20 minutes. And you say something that offends her. And then she does stop. I don't want to do this no more. Get off me. There went your consent. Anything after this, a slight push, a kiss, a touch, is now a crime. Consent can be withdrawn at any time, and this is something that has to be taught even to regular boys and regular women. Men can withdraw their consent. You as a man can withdraw your consent too. But we have understood since the advent of TV that a sleeping woman cannot give consent. A drunk woman, a drunk person cannot give consent. And I say again, if a person is intoxicated to the point where they cannot communicate clearly, they cannot give consent. No excuse. You're having sex, she passes out. Bro, unless you want to go to jail, her passing out withdrew your consent. There's no ifs and or buts about it. Because if the cops came to the door at that moment, I said, stick him up, what's going on in here? Can she say, hey, I wanted this? No. You going to jail. Please don't go to jail over something stupid. Consent. It seems to be the theme for the night. All right, let's review. People with disabilities have the rights to marry, start families, access reproductive health care without discrimination. Practical advice for families. Caregivers, navigating these conversations can be challenging. Here are some actionable tips. 1. Start by normalizing the topic. Be patient and use clear, straightforward language. Use tools like storyboards or role-playing to teach scenarios. Create safe, open spaces for dialogue. You can look to organizations like ARC to be inspired, which promotes the idea that every person, regardless of their ability, has the right to love and to be loved. Sounds like a song. They remind us that sexuality education, this is sex education, the sexuality education isn't just about safety, it's about enabling joy, connection, and self-discovery. So remember, that's the purpose of it. The purpose of sexuality education should be about enabling joy, connections, human connections, satisfying, worthwhile connections, and self-discovery. I could make a comment here, but I want you all to like me. It's just so wrong. I'm advocating for disabled persons, and I got normal people in my life who needs to. They need to read my notes. It's unfair that if you knew me, you know why I'm dying here. I'm not even taking this out. I am leaving this in. OMG. I'm going to have to film this twice. The clock is ticking. Literally, the clock is ticking. There's a big clock on my wall. Advocacy isn't just about speaking out. It's about empowering people to live life to the fullest. Join us in supporting those organizations out here that are championing these rights. They need your support. They need not just your funds, but they also need your hands and ears, and we need more advocates out there. Let us continue the conversation beyond this podcast. If you're a parent, educator, or advocate, take action. Visit the ARC, Kennedy Krieger, or Planned Parenthood's Project Shine for guides and workshops. Advocate for comprehensive, inclusive sexuality education in your community. Start conversations about respect, boundaries, and relationships with the individuals in your life. Together, we can create a world that every individual's rights and dignity are upheld. Remember, respect, rights, and relationships belong to everyone. I'm your host, Freddie. This has been Selling Dreams Podcast.